As I walked through the bustling streets of Cape Town last month, I couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism in the air. The vibrant colors of the Bocap neighborhood, the lively banter at the V&A waterfront, and the entrepreneurial spirit evident everywhere I turned. It was as if the city itself was inhaling a deep breath of fresh opportunity. This feeling wasn't limited to the picturesque avenues of the mother city, however. Across this richly diverse nation, from the urban melting pots to the vast rural expanses, there is a palpable shift underway. After decades of economic stagnation, policy paralysis, and a creeping cynicism that the great democratic promise of 1994 had been squandered, South Africa finally seems poised to reclaim its mantle as the engine of Africa's economic renaissance. The numbers don't lie. According to the respected Bureau for Economic Research, BER, in Stellenbosch, South Africa's GDP is projected to expand at a sprightly 2.2% clip in 2025, the fastest rate in over a decade, excluding the aberrational 2021 rebound from the pandemic recession. This sunny forecast outpaces even the relatively optimistic projections from the South African Reserve Bank, 1.5%, and the historically conservative International Monetary Fund, 1.2%. To the casual observer, such growth figures may seem a tad unspectacular, especially for an emerging market brimming with as much unbridled potential as South Africa. But for those of us who have closely tracked the country's economic trajectory over the past 2 decades, a 2.2% expansion represents nothing short of an inflection point, a decisive upward pivot after years of stagnation, policy uncertainty, and a concerning erosion of both domestic and international confidence. The key factor propelling this long-awaited turnabout? A new government ushered into power following the seismic May 29 elections, where the once dominant African National Congress, ANC, was stripped of its outright parliamentary majority for the first time since Mandela's earliest democratic triumph in 1994. Shaken by this harsh rebuke from an electorate weary of endemic corruption and the ANC's ideological lethargy, the party was compelled to forge an unprecedented governing coalition with smaller, more economically pragmatic parties. To political realists like myself, the prospect of such an alliance was simultaneously unsettling and tantalizing. On one hand, South Africa's tradition of stable single-party dominance had served as a bulwark against the factionalism and parliamentary gridlock that has paralyzed governance in so many other African nations. But that very same concentration of power had also enabled an insidious culture of rent-seeking and graft to take root, compromising the independence of key institutions and devastating both domestic and foreign investor confidence. The new coalition arrangement represents a high-stakes gamble, then a wager that the admission of new ideological diversity into the halls of power will catalyze an economic rebirth, rather than foment the sort of debilitating partisan dysfunction that has plagued coalition governments elsewhere on the continent. And from where I stand today, cautiously optimistic, the early returns have been highly encouraging. Chastened by their electoral drubbing yet gifted a lifeline in the form of continued participation in government, the ANC appears to have had a road to Damascus moment of sorts. No longer can they rely on residual revolutionary bona fides to excuse governance shortcomings or an underwhelming policy agenda. To survive, and someday, hopefully, to regain its erstwhile dominance, the party of Mandela and Mbeki has been compelled to finally embrace a bold, unambiguous pivot toward economic liberalization and competency in governing. The coalition's policy agenda, articulated during the initial consolidation budget, delivered by Finance Minister Godongwana shortly after the new administration took office, represents a stark break from the overly rigid state-driven model that has hamstrung investment and stifled growth for far too long. Its pillars include divestment from dysfunctional and economically draining state-owned enterprises like the perpetually insolvent national electricity provider Eskom, reduction and streamlining of debilitatingly complex regulations that have smothered the growth of new businesses, especially small and medium enterprises, an unapologetic re-embrace of the profit motive, abandoning the toxic anti-imperialist rhetoric that has alienated both domestic and foreign investors. Meaningful steps to address rampant corruption, restoring the credibility of institutions and the rule of law. Perhaps most critically, new initiatives to rapidly upgrade and expand South Africa's antiquated infrastructure networks, curing logistical bottlenecks that have been arguably the single biggest impediment to growth and competitiveness. On this final point, the government has wasted no time in mobilizing resources to address the intractable challenges at ports, rail lines, roads, and other infrastructure choke points. Through the work of Operation Vulindlela, A previously toothless interagency task force reconstituted and reinvigorated under the new governing coalition, a staggering pipeline of roughly 500 billion rand, over $27 billion US, in investment projects has been unlocked to rehabilitate and modernize South Africa's decaying freight transport networks. During the moribund years of the late Zuma and Ramaphosa eras, such investment was persistently hamstrung by indecision, red tape, and the ever-present specter of cronyism and kickbacks attaching itself to any major new infrastructure push. Today, however, the calculus has changed. Spurred by a new climate of bold, market-friendly policy thinking within the cabinet and a bipartisan zeal to prove South Africa remains open for business, projects once relegated to the purgatory of permanent review are now swiftly clearing approval processes and breaking ground. The impact of these investments cannot be overstated. For decades, South Africa's role as the preeminent regional shipping and rail hub has been compromised by inadequate port capacity, debilitatingly slow cargo processing times, and chronic underinvestment in rail maintenance and new line building. With global supply chains still rattled by the pandemic's lingering effects and the jarring geopolitical shocks of the past 2 years, the cost of South Africa's logistics deficiencies has risen exponentially, both for domestic producers seeking to reach international markets, and for global traders hoping to leverage the country's historical role as the gateway to the subcontinent's vast interior markets. Soon, however, an influx of new shipping berths, streamlined customs processing, enhanced rail capacity, and the inevitable improvements in supply chain velocity should rapidly ease these bottlenecks. The impact will be felt far beyond South Africa's own industrial economy. 2. Reimagining the nation's commercial arteries will unlock economic growth across the entire southern African orbit, deepening regional integration while simultaneously re-establishing the nation's status as a globally pivotal shipping choke point on par with the Suez and Panama Canals. The flow of new investment won't be limited to ports and rails, either. The government's policy reset has also catalyzed a new wave of capital inflows into South Africa's rich mineral extraction, value-added manufacturing, and renewable energy sectors, pillars of the economy that had been allowed to steadily erode during the ideological myopia of the Zuma years. Consider Anglo-American Platinum's recent announcement of a $1 billion expansion of refining capacity at its Western Bushveld complex, or Vedanta Resources' $630 million new zinc mine development in the Northern Cape. These were exactly the types of job-creating, value-additive investment that proved so elusive during the ANC's long era of reflexive hostility towards mining interests and international capital. With a new government firmly committed to upholding contracts, cutting red tape, and treating investors as partners in growth, rather than vectors for state interference, South Africa's mining industry is set to experience a renaissance that will pay dividends for decades. In the buzzy renewable energy sector, too, the floodgates have opened. Companies like Brookfield Asset Management, Total Eren, and SB Energy have collectively promised over $25 billion in new wind and solar developments across the country in the coming half-decade, projects that were stalled for years by regulatory inertia and a lingering skepticism towards emissions-free power under the previous administration's coddling of the coal lobby. With the planet's climate crisis accelerating and electricity demands soaring across the African continent, the new government's emphatic open for green investment posture could scarcely be timelier. Of course, the rosy economic vision I've sketched is still far from guaranteed. Significant headwinds and potential pitfalls remain. Most critically, the new governing coalition will need to prove its staying power over the long term. For all the early signs of pragmatic cooperation and ideological realignment, the arrangement still represents an unwieldy alliance of strange bedfellows united more by shared aversion to ANC hegemony than any firm consensus around policy specifics. The risk of the coalition fracturing or devolving into paralyzing internecine squabbles as the next electoral cycle looms cannot be discounted. Nor can one ignore the likelihood of obstructionism from the ANC's more stridently leftist faction, who have already decried the new administration's market-friendly overtures as tantamount to recolonization by rapacious outside interests. Then there are the eternal challenges embedded in South Africa's socio-economic fabric: profound inequality, towering unemployment, lingering service delivery inadequacies in poorer communities, and a perpetual skills mismatch that leaves employers desperate for technical and professional talent. These long-standing structural hindrances won't disappear overnight, coalition politics or not. Policy persistence and deft political management will be essential to prolonging the current pro-growth momentum. The administration must steadfastly resist old temptations to intervene heavy-handedly in private sector affairs or resuscitate the same bloated state enterprises that did so much to erode economic dynamism over the past decade. Similarly, it must prove capable of devolving more economic decision-making to the provincial and municipal levels, rather than allowing an antiquated command and control model to persist. Perhaps most critically in the court of public opinion, the government will need to relentlessly communicate how its reform agenda directly translates into sustainable improvements in quality of life for the nation's downtrodden masses. Economic growth alone, however robust, will not be enough to quell lingering skepticism if its fruits remain confined to the upper echelons of an exceptionally unequal society. These caveats aside, however, my time touring the emerging New South Africa left me incredibly hopeful that the nation has indeed reached an inflection point, a reality I didn't expect to encounter when I first arrived with admittedly pessimistic blinders on. In my conversations with policymakers, executives, investors, entrepreneurs, and ordinary citizens from all walks of life, I sensed a palpable rekindling of the hope and ambition that defined the nation's earliest post-Apartheid years. A wearying era of stagnation, nepotism, and institutional rot appears to be giving way to a pragmatic ethos of getting things done. An unmistakable hunger to rapidly make up for years of missed economic opportunities and rebuilding lost international credibility. Perhaps most symbolic of this national reawakening was my visit to the sparkling new headquarters of the Southern African Renewable Energy Transformation and Integration Council, SAREDIC, in Johannesburg's revitalized Mabening precinct. This impressive public-private initiative, backed by financial commitments from global industrial heavyweights like Siemens and Fluor, serves as a continental hub for research, policy advocacy, and human capital development in pursuit of Africa's aggressive clean energy transition goals. As I toured the cutting-edge facility and spoke to the bright young engineers, developers, and analysts who populate its halls, it struck me just how profoundly the nation's economic mindset and developmental trajectory had shifted in such a short period. Conversations that would have been tinged with cynicism and despair just a few years ago now radiated optimism and an infectious sense of shared purpose. The rhetoric of stale ideological opposition to market-based climate solutions has given way to a fierce determination to position South Africa as the indispensable nexus for the green revolution rapidly sweeping the developing world. The aspirations embodied in the SAREDIC's sleek confines mirror those I encountered throughout my journey. From the dynamic startup ecosystems taking root in Cape Town and Johannesburg, to the mining technocrats bent on re-establishing South Africa as the world's most digitized and environmentally sustainable extraction hub, to the farmers of the Western Cape vineyards embracing agritech to enhance global competitiveness, everywhere I traveled, the shadows of retrenchment and fatalism appeared to be burning away in the illuminating dawn of national economic renaissance. It would be foolish, of course, to become too intoxicated by this prevailing air of strategic confidence and ambition. The path ahead remains arduous, the structural challenges daunting, and the ideological fissures within South African society persistent. Yet, as I prepared to depart this remarkable nation, I found myself newly convinced that the world has perhaps underestimated the catalyzing power of a genuine change election, one that shattered long-standing political dynamics and forced government itself to undergo a philosophic rebirth. In the heady first decades after liberation, the ANC could rationalize drift and insularity as lingering birth pangs of the long struggle against apartheid's injustice. Global goodwill afforded them an allowance period of sorts to find their policy footing as custodians of the new democratic reality. That grace period, it's clear in hindsight, ultimately lapsed into complacency and ideological stagnation, a smothering inertia that slowly crushed both economic vibrancy and public faith in the revolutionary vanguards governing bona fides. Only when voters delivered their shocking multi-party repudiation could the wake-up call no longer be ignored. Confronting an existential reckoning, the ANC's decision to embrace pragmatic coalitionists as full partners rather than resist the election's democratizing verdict proved a pivotal inflection point. Admitting long-alienated business constituencies and market-oriented parties into the decision-making fold forced an abrupt end to a quarter-century of insularity and command economics. A new policy paradigm, once unthinkable from the liberation movement's ranks, was a condition of the ANC's political survival. The rapid about-face was whiplash-inducing, to be sure. Planks that had been derided for decades as inimical to economic transformation, under the ANC's statist model, fiscal prudence, deregulation, privatization, warm embrasure of free trade and foreign direct investment, are now wholehearted tenets of the new ruling coalition. South Africa's sharply revised tone is inducing policy whiplash abroad, too. Just 2 years after the United States Trade Representative stripped the nation of regional trade preferences over staunch boycott, divestment, and sanctions policies targeting Israel, Pretoria is now pivoting towards pursuing a long-anticipated free trade agreement with the Jewish state. Such philosophical resets within establishment parties are exceedingly rare in the developing world. More often, aging independence-era movements ossify into permanent kleptocracy. Witness the sordid reigns of ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe or the MPLA in Angola as lurid examples. When faced with tectonic political shifts, outright expulsion from power is a likelier outcome. That the ANC averted such a fate, embracing outside partners and new ideological precepts in a bid to prolong their governing legitimacy, may thus augur a new season of democratic vigor across the African continent. With single-party dominance no longer assured, stale orthodoxies and cozy nationalist rhetoric may prove liabilities when publics inevitably sour on economic underperformance and institutional decay. Meaningful marketplace of ideas, long subsumed by self-preserving ruling elites, could spark a broader renaissance of policy churn and competition. It's a renaissance, judging by my visit, that is already fully underway in the koning aftermath of South Africa's tectonic 2024 polls. Make no mistake, for all the wariness of their conservative critics, the ANC remains a potent political force and administration heavyweight under the new coalition schema. Yet they've shown a remarkable aptitude for tactical recalibration in service of remaining relevant. From prioritizing World Bank-friendly initiatives like dismantling red tape and reinvigorating the National Ports Authority, to positioning South Africa as a preferred gateway for U.S. corporate involvement across the continent, the party is demonstrating adherence to market realities its Marxist founders would have once considered apostasy. If this retooled posture holds, South Africa may rapidly regain its luster as one of the developing world's most credible and engaged economic partners. There are, of course, pragmatists beyond South Africa's borders who will question whether the renaissance I've described is meaningfully durable beyond this current election cycle. The road to backsliding in African nations newly seized by reform fevers is tragically well-trod. For every Botswana that leveraged multi-party democracy and free market fidelity into lasting prosperity, too many nations like Kenya or Tanzania cycled through brief periods of market-based policy curiosity before slipping backward into cronyism and bloated statism.